As we dig into the New Testament, it's very helpful to get a background understanding of the New Testament so that we can really understand exactly what the authors of the New Testament are trying to communicate to us. So we want to look in this session just very, very briefly at the history and culture that informs the New Testament. To get us started, we're going to take a little virtual trip. Can't go back in time actually, but to see some of the places that Paul might have seen back in his day. And then take just a very, very quick overview of the historical period, and finally look at some of the cultural features of the New Testament period. So we begin our virtual tour of the ancient world at the very center of the ancient world, especially the seat of the Roman emperor. So we're in Rome, and here's a picture of me right there at the spot where the emperor would have made his decrees. And it looks like the power is going to my head because I think maybe I'm trying to exile an unruly student or something like that. Next, we go down from that spot was actually at the top of what we call the Palatine Hill, where the emperors lived, and just below that we find the Roman Forum, where the life of the city took place. This picture is a picture of the Forum. The preceding picture would have been up on the right, and we're looking down from one end of the Forum all the way back across the other end. Notice, please, the little triangle, dark triangle on the lower left where you see a bunch of people. That's actually the spot where Julius Caesar was cremated. If we stay in that same spot and turn around in the other direction, we actually can see the Temple of Saturn. Well, I should say what's left today of the Temple of Saturn. But just in front of the columns that formed that temple, you can see this low brick wall. That low brick wall is called the rostrum. This is the place where the orators would come. They would gather crowds at the base of that wall and deliver their point of view to try to make people see things their way. Turning again from that same spot, just around to the right is the Senate House. So you can see that the senators might easily come out of their chambers, come to the rostrum, and deliver their speeches for everyone to see. Back up to the Palatine Hill actually is where this particular picture was taken. But the reason that I wanted you to see this picture is because whenever we see pictures or when we see the ruins themselves, we often think, wow, it must have been a drab existence. But this picture, you can see the marble that was actually on those walls. So what we're seeing, you might say, is just the skeleton of what was there. All of these skeletons would have been covered with marble, and actually quite exquisite marble, so nicely polished and carved. Very beautiful it must have been in those days. Back down on the Forum, you can see the far end now of that Roman Forum, and what you're looking at is the Arch of Titus. Now this is especially important for New Testament studies. If we zoom in on the Arch of Titus, you can see here why this arch was there. This arch commemorates the destruction of the Jewish temple. You can see in this photo the Roman soldiers carrying off the artifacts from the Jewish temple. Especially you can notice the menorah, which would have been in the Jewish temple when it was destroyed. They carried it away. So I hope you enjoyed your little brief virtual tour. Let's think about the historical context of the New Testament. First of all, we can say that there were superpowers. Like we have superpowers in the world today, there were two superpowers in those days. The one that is most important for the New Testament is the superpower Rome, which we just visited on our virtual tour. But the other power was to the east of Palestine, and that was Parthia. Now we don't hear much about Parthia in the New Testament, but it informs so much of what's going on because Palestine is on the frontier between the superpower Rome on the one hand and the superpower Parthia on the other. And so although Palestine, where Jesus was born and lived, is so far removed from the center of power in Rome, nevertheless, because it exists as the frontier between the archenemy, shall we say, of Rome, the Parthians, control of that piece of land was so very important. So it informs much of what's going on in the New Testament. To get a timeline, we can go back well before the New Testament period, and we have the Alexander the Great. Now, I had mentioned in a previous session about the Hellenization. This actually begins in the time of Alexander the Great because Alexander the Great was a Greek and he conquered the known world. But when he died at a very or a relatively young age, his empire was divided up. He divided it up amongst his generals, and so came to power the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Seleucids vied for power with the Ptolemies, back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes the Ptolemies were more powerful, sometimes the Seleucids. And the Ptolemies were centered in Egypt. The Seleucids were centered in Syria. And once again, you can see right in the middle was Palestine. So the vying for control back and forth impacted what was happening in Palestine. But at one particular point, neither the Ptolemies nor the Seleucids were very strong. And that gave opportunity for the Jews to gain independence. And it was under the Maccabees that happened. So we have the Maccabean revolt and the Maccabean period. But it wasn't long that they could maintain their independence and their control. And they actually invited the Romans to come as allies to help them to defend against the Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north. But the consequence eventually was that the Romans took over. So they were the key authority in the New Testament period until actually they conquered Jerusalem in 70 at the destruction of the temple in 70. So that's a really, really important time. Before that, in the New Testament period, they were still ruling in Palestine, but they did so through governors and, of course, the Herods as well earlier in the period. But toward the end of our New Testament period, they took over completely. They destroyed Jerusalem, and that's a very important event for us. When we look at the cultures of the first century, we talk about the Circum-Mediterranean culture. Now, there's a little bit of danger in doing so because there's so many, many cultures around the Mediterranean. Circum, by the way, means around. Mediterranean, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea. So we're talking about all of the cultures around the Mediterranean Sea. But there are many aspects of the cultures that are in common. So, of course, many differences, but also many things in common. I just want to mention a few. First of all is limited good. Limited good means that everything that's good in life comes in only limited quantities. So people were constantly vying for their fair share of what was good. The thing that was considered of highest good is honor. So we have honor-shame cultures in the Circum-Mediterranean region as well. Always striving to get honor for oneself and not lose honor to others. We have also dyadic personality. Dyadic personality is simply this: the idea that if I want to know who I am, I don't look inside myself to find out who I am. I ask my friends who I am. So they are my dyadic partners. They tell me who I am. And so my personality is built up by what those people around me say that I am. And finally, we have patronage. Patronage links up to all of those other aspects. Patronage is the idea that a patron, a wealthy patron, will give what the patron has a lot of, especially money, in exchange for something that the patron wants even more, especially the highest good in the culture, which is honor. So the patron will give money to someone who needs it. In exchange, that person will then give honor to the patron. So how do we deal with all of these historical and cultural perspectives when it comes to looking at the New Testament itself? I would like to suggest a 4-step process for accessing all of these cultural and historical things in the interpretation of the New Testament. Step 1, determine the original audience of the particular document that you're studying. So which book of the New Testament are you looking at? And ask yourself, is this written to a Greco-Roman audience or a Jewish audience? Depending on which audience that is, makes a big difference in how you understand the document. Step 2, are there any general or specific cultural characteristics that inform the text? So general characteristics are the ones that we just mentioned. The specific ones would be specific to Greco-Roman culture or Jewish culture. You might have to dig in a little bit to answer that question. Step 3 is to ask, is the text more cultural or more countercultural? One of the mistakes that people make is just to assume that the New Testament only reflects the culture, is just an example of the culture itself. But in many cases, the New Testament is critiquing the culture, saying it ought not to be that way. So we have to analyze the text. Is it just simply repeating the cultural scripts, or is it critiquing and correcting those? So step 4 is asking the question, so what? Now that we know all of those things, what is the meaning of the text? What is the text trying to teach us in light of step 1, step 2, and step 3?